Hello and welcome to the Legal Edition. I'm your host, Attorney Mary Kay Elloian. Our show topic today, the intersection of domestic violence and reproductive justice. Where do those delineations fall? Our guests are Azelia Kalia. She is the legal director at Legal Momentum and overseer of the organization's litigation and policy initiatives. We also have with us Lynn Heck-Shafran, Senior Vice President, Legal Momentum, and Director of its National Judicial Education Program, promoting justice for men and women in the courts. Let's welcome our guests. Welcome, everyone. Now, the situation with domestic violence and pregnancy is off the charts these days. Can you tell us what have you heard with regards to this post-Roe reality?
Well, what we're seeing is just on the front of everyday newspapers. You don't even have to go digging deep for statistics. You can see what's being covered in the news. And what's making news all over the country is articles about women who are victimized, who are victims of domestic violence, and who are having to stay with their abuser because they are pregnant. And we see this as another way that abusers, who are very wily and very clever, and they're looking at this as a way to keep control of the woman that they have been abusing. And it could be same sex as well, but mostly we're talking about women. And what I think is interesting, I do a lot of work on the Hague Convention, which, if that's unfamiliar, involves the civil problems of international child abduction. And what we realized today is that when that was being drafted, the drafters, domestic violence was nowhere on their agenda anywhere. They just didn't even think of it. And we're now having to go back and try to deal with this treaty and the way it's implemented in the United States, because what's happening is that children and mothers are being sent back to what's called the country of habitual residence. And literally there are women who are being killed when they return, when they are forced to return because they don't want to let their children go back alone. So both internationally and nationally, this is truly a dire situation.
Yeah, and I will add also that we've heard from our colleagues at the National Domestic Violence Hotline who have reported to us that they've seen a tremendous uptick in the calls around reproductive coercion. People are really scared. People are really frightened. And we know that access to health care, including abortion care, is critical to survivors, securing safety for themselves. I don't know if you're familiar with the statistics, but there are 2 times in a survivor's life where, and I'm going to use she, but as we all know, this can happen to anybody, when she is most vulnerable, when the risk of lethality is the highest, and that is during pregnancy and during the postpartum period, and also when attempting to leave an abusive relationship. So the fact that we are living in this Dobbs reality where there's so many restrictions and increasing limitations on access to abortion care and reproductive health care, that really limits the choices that survivors can make, and it can force them to stay with abusers, to have a child with someone that they desperately do not want to have a child with, that they're trying to actually escape from. So it is really concerning, to say the least, what's happening across the country. And as you know, Mary Kay, I don't have to tell you, over half of our states, or almost half of our states, have either bans or near total bans, or severe restrictions, limitations on the right that was a constitutional right up until Dobbs.
And here's a little something else that used to be available to women who are under any circumstances, but certainly in circumstances where they're trying to escape violence. There are a couple of states where you can't get a divorce if you're pregnant. Now, this was undoubtedly invented, shall we say, with good intentions. The thought was, okay, father doesn't want to stay in this marriage because he doesn't want to have to deal with this child. He doesn't want to get hit up for child support. And we're going to make it legally impossible for him to walk away. Well, now, we use that word weaponized, and it really is the right word. So now you have, how is that impacting the person who's trying to get away? If you're pregnant and by law in your state, you cannot leave.
That's devastating. That's absolutely devastating.
I mean, if you think about it, that's really terrifying.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to say that it's those states that already have really poor social safety nets for women. We're talking about Missouri, Texas, and Arkansas. These are not states known for their, Medicaid expansion or, social safety nets or, financial and other supports and services for women and moms. And so, to say that they can't even have that control over their life is really shocking.
But what about the women and girls who are victims of rape or incest? What happens when they're forced to have a child? Who is going to support that? And will the perpetrator end up going to the court and saying, I want visitation rights, subjecting to the victim to trauma all over again? What happens in situations like this?
Well, this is a topic that I talk about a lot because everybody talks about why is this statute, yes, you have an abortion ban, but there's a carve out in cases of incest and rape. And I don't know whether this is being done deliberately or the people who are writing these bills, they really don't know anything about how the justice system works and what happens to someone who is a survivor of rape or incest. The fact is that very few victims ever report. So how are you going to prove, air quotes, that you were victimized in this way? Now, I did see one or two states that actually say you've got to have some kind of a piece of paper from law enforcement that you went and you made a report. Well, unfortunately, what we know is that while there is a tremendous effort going on around the country to develop education for law enforcement and everyone in the justice system about trauma-informed response, about how you should deal. There's a project that's called Start by Believing, EVAI, End Violence Against Women International. That doesn't mean that you do not, investigate and deal with the case in full. But when someone comes into your office or calls you up and says, I am a victim of rape, you do not say, what color shoes was he wearing? As happened in a very famous case recently in New York City. And I'm smiling because the absurdity of it. But the fact is that these carve-outs are basically meaningless. Every now and then, there is someone who does go to, law enforcement, who is treated with respect. But how you prove it in time to get the abortion, not going to happen. So these, and then going on to what you were talking about, Mary Kay, there are states, absolutely states, where someone who has been convicted of rape can get custody, not just visitation, but you can end up in a joint custody situation with the man who raped you. And this is a lifetime, well, it's not a lifetime, but until the child is 18, you've got this awful person in your life.
Or 21 in some states.
21 in some states, okay,
yeah.
Even worse.
And, prior to my current role, I spent over a decade representing survivors of domestic and sexual violence in family court, Supreme Court, and divorces, getting them orders of protection, working within the criminal legal system. And yeah, Mary Kay, rapists, and I hate to use such an inflammatory word, but it is what they are. Like, they have been convicted of rape. There are criminal, legal proceedings against them. It's been tried. Rapists, especially in the context of intimate partner relationships, often do get joint legal custody, sometimes joint physical custody. They refuse to pay support. They refuse to support the children, but they will, demand that they see them, every other Saturday and, every other Father's Day. and really assert their parental rights, and not realizing the trauma that they're inflicting, the additional trauma that they're inflicting, not only on, the survivor, but the child too, who, may or may not know the origins of their birth.
This is a really sad state of affairs that we're in. I don't think these legislators, they don't have a clue as to the repercussions. They just get on the right to life bandwagon without any idea of what's going on. And one of my pieces that I wrote about, I wrote about that when the child is in the womb, they're all on board, right to life. But when the child is in the classroom, free for all, Second Amendment.
Yes.
Just tells me the hypocrisy here. You can't get much clearer than that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that it's really, it's the ironies on the hypocrisy are, extraordinary, but very simple things that are going on in European countries, particularly, to minimize the need for abortion. Now, if you really wanted to do that, you would have excellent sex education that began when the children were very young, which is what they do, for example, in the Netherlands, which has an extremely low rate of abortion and unwanted children and so on and so on. You would have terrific education around the issue of respect, so that people would understand. I mean, we are right now in an epidemic of young men watching porn and thinking that girls and young women like to be strangled during sex. This is truly a national epidemic. Now, and the girls, they think they have to comply or they don't look cool. Now, this doesn't even require any further elaboration.
No, it doesn't. It really doesn't need,
Yeah.
This is insane.
Yeah.
Because, I'm sure some people will end up getting asphyxiated and die as a result of it. I mean, this is just insane. But the message that you're saying is most important, is the message. And unfortunately, our country is not getting the right messages from either lawmakers or, as it sounds like, even education.
Well, there's no question about that. And as I say, we absolutely do know by looking at the policies and the practices in other countries that there are ways to minimize the need for abortion. And if people were truly interested in doing that, they would follow that path, because it's been shown to be successful. And then, as Azalea was saying before, what are the safety nets? What kind of support is there for children who are coming into the world in very straitened circumstances, whether it's economic or psychological, whatever it is? We don't have that. We claim to be really interested in children and all the rest of it, but we're not.
Mm-hmm. Now, misoprostone, if I'm saying that correctly, is one of the drugs used, to prevent unwanted, childbirth. Many of the states now are trying to legislate against that, from my understanding. Now, I don't know if the U.S. Supreme Court is taking on this case, but I know Griswold v. Connecticut was one of the foremost cases about contraception. Is there any other cases that you see, potentially coming down the pike, or any philosophies you see that could cause this type of case to be overturned?
Well, the case was taken up by the Supreme Court. I believe, Lynn, that Legal Momentum supported an amicus brief, to allow the access, and to allow the FDA to continue to regulate these types of drugs. And we know that medication abortion is now currently the preferred method of getting an abortion, and it's the most common method of getting an abortion. And we certainly hope that the Supreme Court will uphold access, because, to take yet another choice away from women, would just be shocking, and it would be such a slippery slope, because once that access is taken away, then everything else is up for grabs. What's
Exactly.
next? Contraceptives, like,
Exactly.
where are we going with this? And this actually just reminds me, I shared an article with Lynn the other day about how I think it's the state of Louisiana who is now proposing to treat mifepristone as in the same class of drugs as opioids, and that people that are in possession of it can be subject to the same penal penalties, criminal penalties, as someone who is in possession of opioids. So it's really scary what's happening in our country, and the fact that this very conservative court is making these determinations should give every American pause, because what's next? What's next? Obviously Roe was overturned, and then that in of itself is such a dangerous precedent. You're overturning 50 years, half a century of settled jurisprudence. Stare decisis is one of the first things that they teach you in law school. Stare decisis, is such an
The
important
end all be
principle.
all.
Yeah,
Right.
it's such an important principle. And for them to do this is really terrifying. We're really rolling things back. And I think every American should be concerned, because, it could be their rights next.
Right. But it's interesting. There's never any rules regarding men and vasectomies or anything like that. I find that very disingenuous of the court.
Right. I mean, I wonder if men took a contraceptive pill, like if there would be so much discussion about it. That's a whole other podcast.
Right,
Would
right,
they?
right.
I think there's been
But
research that
it's
says that they
coming down
probably
the pike, because
well,
I've seen several articles recently about the development of a male contraceptive. And I think the question for any woman has to be, can you trust that, no matter who the person is and how much you love him? No, because he could forget, just the way you can forget to take a pill.
right.
Right, right. So I guess the question comes down to, it appears there is gender bias everywhere, from what it sounds like, whether it's the courts, the legislators. I think, Lynn, you've done a lot in that area, I believe. Tell us what you found in your judicial education programs.
Well, Legal Momentum started the National Judicial Education Program to promote equality for women and men in the courts in 1980. And we have been successful in the sense that when we started, there was total disbelief, even by people who said, oh, we know there's gender bias in the courts, but you will never get the judiciary to acknowledge this. And we have gotten over that hump. Not across the board, but in many places we have succeeded in showing people that inadvertently, because they lack basic factual information. I mean, in the sphere that we're talking about, people are making laws who don't know how babies are made, and that is not an exaggeration. One of the most absurd that I've read about is a legislator who, when he was told about an ectopic pregnancy, he said, okay, so the baby is developing outside the womb, so you could just take it, that nice cell and the embryo, and you could move it, you could put it back where it belongs. I mean, I've had really extraordinary experiences with people saying to me or sending me a note saying, I didn't realize that I was dealing with domestic violence for years and years in circumstances of sentencing of women who've been forced to participate in some kind of criminal activity. And the, when you look back and you have to sort of, what's the balance? What have we achieved and what's not out there? I mean, what we haven't achieved yet. Now, the Supreme Court that you were just talking about a moment ago, they are taking to conference a case which Legal Momentum is very involved in because it is specifically about gender bias. A woman was convicted of killing her husband. There was a sentencing procedure. During this sentencing procedure, the entire focus of the prosecution was, what kind of clothes did she wear? Was she a good mother? Was she a hoochie, quote unquote? And, you know, just on and on and on.
And they were parading her thong
oh,
to
yes, the best
to the
part.
jury,
how could I leave that
and
out?
they called her a slut
Right.
while holding up her underwear.
That's
Yeah.
disgusting.
So
There's no bearing on anything.
So the Supreme Court is going to consider whether to take on this case, which is a due process case, because clearly this woman did not get a fair trial. And it will be very interesting to see whether they take it on. If you look at the jurisprudence around race discrimination and due process in the legal process, it's the standards are very clear, you know, but here we don't have strict scrutiny, as we say in the law, around issues of discrimination against women. Maybe this is the opportunity to get it because this is so blatant. But then again, I really can see this court saying that, well, what they did was obnoxious, but there was a mountain of evidence. So, you know, it was harmless error, and walking away from it. I would not be surprised.
Yeah, for those viewers who are watching, strict scrutiny is the highest scrutiny a court can give for an issue such as gender-based. And gender-based doesn't get strict scrutiny. It gets lower level scrutiny by the court.
Justice Ginsburg fought her whole life to get to strict scrutiny, and the best she could get out of the court was heightened scrutiny.
Right.
Intermediate scrutiny. Well, in New York, on the November ballot, we will have the opportunity for an equal rights amendment in New York, which hopefully the hope is that it will facilitate, you know, strict scrutiny around these issues. But Mary Kay, what I wanted to just loop back to when you were talking about how discriminatory some of these legislators are, when they were debating you know, some abortion limitation in the rape, in the case of rape, you know, or incest in these total ban states. There was one legislator, I forget his name, it was an old white man, I believe, who said that in the case of rape, the body just has a way of shutting that whole thing down. Just shutting it down. And actually the evidence, the scientific data proves the opposite point, that in cases of rape, there's a higher probability of conception because the body is under such stress and trauma and attack, and the hormone levels, the cortisol levels, like your bodily reaction to, you know, being attacked and being in this, you know, state of trauma and this fight or fight response, you know, it has you know, consequences on how,
so it heightens the chance of conception, is what you're saying. Heightened hormonal response heightens conception.
Yes.
Well, obviously that legislator never read the science book that discussed that. So
it's just shocking to think that, you know, these are, you know, legislative leaders. These are the people that have been elected to, you know, represent the people and make these decisions. And he thinks that, you know, if a woman is being raped, if a person is being raped, the body can just shut that whole thing down. That's where we are as a country.
Yes,
but I remember, you know, in terms of how one defines gender bias, I mean, we say, yes, you know, absolutely having stereotyped notions of the appropriate role for women and men, and discounting the value of work that is perceived as women's work. But so much of what goes wrong flows from a lack of basic substantive knowledge about what's real in the lives of women and men. And this is just I think the most extreme, but the most telling example that people are making laws about abortion and they literally do not know how babies are made. And we are waiting for a decision to come down from the Supreme Court. And Azalea, you should talk about this because I know you've been somewhat involved in this, but the emergency care situation. This is, even talking about it is upsetting.
Right. Mary Camp, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but the EMTALA case was heard by the oral arguments were heard last month, April 24th. And essentially it's the Idaho case. And Idaho has basically a total ban on the procedure. And after that total ban was enacted, the Biden administration issued guidance saying that under federal law, if abortion care was deemed emergency care, Idaho providers would still have to, perform the procedure. Because the law, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, says that if a person shows up to an emergency department with an emergency condition, the emergency department must stabilize that patient, must provide stabilizing care. And there are cases where, pregnant patients would show up, bleeding, hemorrhaging, having organ failure, having preeclampsia, in very, very serious risk of death or serious, organ failure or fertility issues in the future. And this left Idaho providers with, a very horrific dilemma of complying with state law, which says no abortion unless the person is dying, or federal law, which says that, you must stabilize a patient and address any threat to their health, any risk to their health, which includes, a limb, an organ, a system, to provide that stabilizing care. And Idaho is saying that there's no conflict between the federal law EMTALA and their Idaho ban. And so the Supreme Court heard arguments, and I think that we're nervous about it. There was definitely a split in the court among ideological lines. The justices that were conservative, and I think it was Justice Thomas who was talking about fetal personhood, like really having this fetal personhood language in the arguments about why does the law say active labor? Why does the law say unborn child? And the reason is because when the law was enacted about 40 years ago, poor women, low-income women would not get treated. They would be, in various stages of pregnancy, and they would not be treated because they couldn't pay. And that was actually the legislative intent behind the law, was to enable, low-income, underinsured, uninsured patients to get basic emergency care. And that is the only real right to universal health care that we have in this country, when you think about it. It's just that if you present to an emergency department, you must get stabilizing treatment. And so, this dilemma is really putting women's lives at risk, patients' lives at risk. It's putting providers in this absurd, quandary of, what do they do? Do they do what's right for the patient and stabilize the patient, and then maybe face jail time, or
risk losing their license, or risk,
or getting, fined,
right.
or do they do, what they went to medical school for, was to, help patients and
save lives.
and save lives. Yeah.
If you don't stabilize the patient, this is not good for the fetus either. No one comes out ahead in this circumstance.
Yeah, they're putting the doctors in an untenable dichotomy. What do you do? And that's, they're going to be less providers that are going to provide care.
They're already leaving. They're already leaving the state. And we've seen this mass exodus, really, of reproductive health care and maternal fetal health specialists in these states with bans or severe restrictions. They don't want to be there. They don't want to practice there. And you have states that already are, maternity care deserts where people have to travel, great distances, to get the care that they need. That's already happening. And, for Black women, women of color, low income women, it's already bad. This is just going to make it, into a complete crisis. And so, like you were saying, Mary Kay, like if these legislators and these courts really cared about children and families, they would put, laws and precedent in place that protect their rights instead of stripping them away.
Sometimes I think, though, things have to get so bad in order to go the opposite direction. And so these abortion deserts, they're not going to have any providers. So they're not going to have any probably doctors that want to even practice obstetrics. So
Exactly.
So the problem is they're going to get what they didn't want in the first place. They wanted to stop all abortion, but then they're going to stop all other care that's even related to
Exactly.
So,
yeah, you could have a very wanted pregnancy, a very wanted pregnancy that was, out of like the best optimal, wonderful relationship, and yet you have nowhere to go to get the care that you need to, have that healthy pregnancy.
It's like, be careful what you wish for, legislators,
Exactly. Well, we'll see how it plays out, but at this rate, it is really making things a lot worse for.
In Florida, I believe they're in a almost total ban, but they're having a referendum in a few months. So I feel bad for the women in between.
It's going to be on the ballot in the fall.
Yeah, that won't help anybody right now.
No, and it's already, Florida was the state where, patients from across the South were going to access that type of care. And now with this ban that went into effect on May 1st, there's nowhere. I think that I think Planned Parenthood or the Center for American Progress has a map that shows driving distances, that shows just how far you have to go to get the care that you need. And, talk about undue burden, they're not only limiting, they're adding, for other obstacles, other hurdles. And I remember hearing some testimony from some legislator about, oh, it's not so bad getting on a bus. Just get on a bus and go, go to a different state. And I was just so taken with the level of condensation and like such, patronizing language. Like it really showed to me that, the experience of these patients is not valued. Their lives are not valued. It was like such a dismissive and such a minimizing tone to take. It really just doesn't show any regard or respect for women and patients' lives.
Well, I think Texas even goes beyond that because they will there's punitive damages to those helping the woman even leave.
Right. So we're pitting people against each other.
Exactly.
Like it's really shocking what, where we are as a country. Like I still can't really wrap my mind around it. And when you said that, Mary Kay, it just reminded me of the case that Lynn raised recently about this man in Texas who opened or is trying to open an investigation into his former partner because she was trying to access abortion care. So he wants the court to investigate her, track her, and see what the outcomes were in her case.
I just want to go back with this traveling thing, because in terms of people not getting it, not thinking through what are the consequences in people's real lives. So yes. if you are a pregnant person and you need to travel X miles to get care, not even abortion care, but if you're living in a maternity care desert, you could be someone who has a high-risk pregnancy. There are many, many reasons why you need to have an OBGYN. And it's not just like you show up at the Greyhound station, you buy your ticket and you go away, right? So a lot of these situations, you have to be counseled for a day or two. So people have to arrange, they have to have childcare if they have children in their family. They have to be away from their work, which is maybe very difficult. You may not be able to get leave. and you have to take the time to go to wherever it is that you need to go to. And then if there has to be counseling, you have to either stay there until you've, gone through the 2 or 3 days, whatever it is, or you have to go home and you have to come back. These are very expensive situations, and people in every possible way are not able to afford this, and they shouldn't be forced to do it. And especially, it's just not thought through. I mean, as we were saying, there are literally states where people who want to have their children, but they are there's a lovely phrase, about elderly, this in Latin, but it's, an elderly first-time mother. I saw that once on my own record, so I was horrified. And but people who are really in serious circumstances, who are high risk, who maybe need genetic counseling because the risk of something very, very seriously wrong if they proceed with a pregnancy is out there. And none of this factors into the thinking of the people who are passing these laws. And one day it's going to happen to them.
Anything else that you two would like to add before we close, or anything else that's outstanding that you'd like to talk about?
Well, I think that those of us who understand what is happening here and who are genuinely concerned about women and children, we just have to keep pursuing these goals, because the people who are on the other side, I don't think they can be reasoned with. Some of them because of their ideology, some of them because they really don't get it. They think if there's an ectopic pregnancy, you can just move that little fetus from it's developing on the
Outside to the
uterus. You can just pick it up and put it in the right place. Now, I'm not saying that if they got some education, they would understand, what they ought to be, supporting, but maybe, right?
It might be a step in the right direction.
Yeah, but I think that that those of us who are committed to genuine support for women and children, you just have to keep moving. And one of these days the pendulum will swing. Now, between now and then, a lot of damage will be done, but I think we just have to keep going.
Well, what other choice do we have?
Exactly. We have to keep going. And in closing, next month we'll hear the decision from the Supreme Court on the Rahimi case. The Rahimi case is the case of domestic abusers' access to firearms. And we'll see whether the Supreme Court will decide that domestic abusers have more rights than survivors. Or that guns have more rights than survivors. It is a dangerous time for women. And as we said, pregnancy and postpartum periods are especially lethal. And to have, abusers have unfettered access to firearms, which is, a big part of that lethality assessment that's done, is really striking. And it's really, I think, emblematic of the larger issue that, like that Lynn was saying, that courts and legislatures just don't understand the real life impacts of their decision making. No,
I agree. I do agree. Well, it's been a pleasure having you both. I've enjoyed our discussion, and I look forward to more, maybe when that other case is decided. Thank you.
Thank
you so
Mary
much,
Kay.
Mary Kay. It was great talking with you. Thank you.
Same here. I want to thank our guests for sharing their insights and opinions on domestic violence and reproductive justice in America and around the world. I also want to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in. For more information on today's topic and our guests, visit us online at thelegaledition.com. And as always, this information is for general educational purposes. It is not to be construed as legal or personal advice. So please consult a qualified practitioner as to your own legal or personal needs. And don't forget, subscribe online. Find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter, now X.